Hi there, my name is Alex. I'm a tired-looking white guy in a wheelchair with a copper-colored beard and curly hair. This is my talk, a fresh set of specs, accessibility for ideation. This talk is geared a little bit more toward designers, but hopefully a general audience will also find it helpful. So, off we go. So just to start off, a little bit about me. I am a game designer. I worked this year on a little game called Sacre Bleu, which was a hack and slash platformer where you play as a little musketeer that breaks out of prison. I am also an accessibility consultant at PlayAbility Consultancy, where I am the founder and strength and dexterity barrier expert. I also happen to be a mutant cyborg, which might need a little bit of an explanation. The mutant part comes from my disability being caused by a genetic mutation, and the cyborg part comes from a titanium rod being fused to my spine to correct scoliosis. So in the most literal sense, I am a mutant cyborg. So what are we doing today? We are exploring how using accessibility barriers as design lenses could help create new and innovative games. So let's jump into it. Let's start by stealing some language from The Art of Game Design, a book of lenses by Jesse Schell, which is, I think, a superb design book. So what do we mean by lenses? Simply a tool to change your perspective or framework on the quest to make intriguing games. Just a way to look at things slightly differently. So we can swap out the lenses and our design spectacles to view how we approach designing games in novel, new, interesting ways. Now, the next ingredient. I believe constraints foster creativity. By limiting the possibility space, it can guide you toward new and interesting design approaches. Coming up with a fresh design or mechanic can be daunting even at the best of times. So to help overcome that bone-chilling dread of a blank piece of paper, you can create artificial constraints. So where can we find some helpful constraints? In accessibility resources, such as the Games Accessibility Guidelines, the Able Gamers Accessible Player Experience, or the Microsoft Inclusive Design Reference. So first off, the Games Accessibility Guidelines. This is a great introductory resource. The example I've chose to highlight here is the idea of more complex control schemes require higher degrees of motor and cognitive skill. So if you're able to make those controls simpler, they are inherently more accessible. This is a great place to start if you're just beginning your game's accessibility journey. Next up, we have the Accessible Player Experience, or APX, because everything has to have a fun little 3-letter acronym. This is a list of 22 design patterns. If I'm being totally honest, one of the reasons I really like it is because I am a visual learner and it has pretty pictures. So the pattern I've picked out here is do more with less, which suggests simplifying your controls to making them more accessible. And last but certainly not least, we have the Microsoft Inclusive Design Reference. This reference material helps identify potential barriers for players and does a great job providing a holistic view of inclusive design. The category I highlighted here is the mobility endurance section, which outlines what barriers someone with a mobility disability may face. So all three of these examples sort of broadly gesture at the same idea, that simpler controls can be more accessible to players. So now that we have some specifications on how accessibility can act as design lenses, what kind of games could we make with that? Well, maybe something like one-button bosses, which was developed by Midnight Munchies and published by Outersloth. It's a bullet hell sort of game that uses one button for both player movement and shooting, sort of like a on-rails bullet hell, which I think is a really interesting design. Now, I'm not saying that one-button bosses used accessibility for ideation in its creation, just using it as an example for what this could look like as an end goal. Now, this isn't the only kind of accessibility barrier that can be leveraged, but first, a brief disclaimer. So, maps lie to you. So, much like the Mercator projection, stretches out Greenland so it appears much larger than it actually is in relation to other parts of a map. This next part I'm about to talk about isn't strictly true, but it is helpful. Barriers don't break down into neat little categories. For example, adjustable game speed as a solution can address barriers for many kinds of players. So, really all I'm trying to say is, the next part, not strictly true, but it is helpful. There are 8 categories where barriers can exist. Low vision, blind, colorblind, straight to dexterity, hard of hearing or deaf, cognitive, emotional, and speech. I'll be giving game examples that use interesting features or mechanics that, by design, address accessibility barriers to hopefully spark your imagination for your own projects. First up, we have low vision. So players may have reduced vision and are unable to differentiate between objects in a scene. Interesting point here, the ability to read 20-point font at 20 feet away is why it's referred to as 20/20 vision, and the term legally blind refers to 20/200 vision or worse, so not being able to read 200-point font at 20 feet away. So you may have some vision while still being considered legally blind. Now, a game that addressed low vision barriers in an interesting way is Mirror's Edge. It had a high contrast mode that guides the player built into the very core of the game, where objects within the game are highlighted in this bright red color, sort of like yellow paint of today, but red, and with style. So, blind barriers. Unlike a low vision barrier, where something like high contrast would be helpful, blind barriers can be addressed with rich audio feedback rather than visual changes. A game that did an interesting job of this is Blind Drive, a comedy driving game where you're being chased by police while driving into incoming traffic, while blindfolded and handcuffed to the steering wheel. This game uses binaural audio shifting sound from ear to ear to communicate oncoming obstacles, and this sort of thoughtful design made the game fully accessible to blind players. So, colorblind barriers. So a player may be unable to differentiate between colors in a scene, and this covers red, green, and blue color blindness, and that is on a scale of severity. The big sciencey names for this are protanopia, deuteranopia, and tritanopia, as well as the rare achromatopsia, where you see in pure black and white. So Ghost Recon Breakpoint addressed this colorblind barrier in an interesting way by adding a number of stripes to the usual item rarity colors, that being green, blue, purple, etc. Designing for that constraint of people who can't differentiate by color also added extra reinforcement for easier recognition of the age-old question, is this gun any good? So, strength and dexterity barriers. This barrier area is where my lived experience primarily lies. For me at least, first-person shooters can be tough. There are lots of inputs in rapid succession, and that creates a number of barriers for me. Something like turn-based gameplay is a lot easier, where I'm able to play at my own pace and plan out my actions. Now, on the surface, these things don't really seem to mix, but I present to you the Fallout 3 VAT system, where you're able to pause time, pick your shots, and that created a much more accessible experience for me. Now, I'm confident that the VAT system wasn't designed with accessibility in mind. However, I think the authorial intent of a design doesn't matter as much as the fact that it addresses a barrier. Regardless if it was intended or not, it's worth adding to the designer's toolbox as an approach that included more players and a richer experience. Next up, we have hard of hearing or deaf barriers. So a player may be unable to hear auditory elements. Now, games can be hard of hearing or deaf accessible just by audio not being used as a feedback channel to the player, or said another way, that the sound doesn't matter. So something like City Skylines is entirely playable by a player simply by the nature that you do not need to have any audio feedback in order to play through that whole game. Now, however, if auditory feedback is integral to your gameplay, something like Fortnite's Sound Visualizer is an interesting design space to explore. The Fortnite Sound Visualizer was originally created for people who couldn't play with sound, like on public transport. That choice helped people with hearing loss, and eventually was adopted by the whole player base. Alright, next up, cognitive accessibility. So, cognitive accessibility is very broad and includes things like dyslexia, sensory overload, motion sickness, among other things. Part of cognitive accessibility is addressing cognitive load, that being the amount of information you expect a player to hold in their head all at once. Games that are like Metroidvanias tend to have these overwhelming maps. Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown addressed this with the memory shard system, where you're able to pin screenshots of the map onto the map itself, taking some of the hard work off the player with this elegant, wonderful little design. So, next up, emotional barriers. So what is this barrier? Players may experience content that provokes strong emotional reactions to the point where they are unable to continue playing, and a solution may be cozy games don't need trigger warnings. Except They still do sometimes. A game like Chicory allowed you to turn off the wet sounds that may bother some players. This addressed misophonia, where certain sounds trigger extreme emotional responses. When we talk about cozy or wholesome games, I think we are alluding to a vibe more than a particular aesthetic or design. I just want to caution designers not to fall into the trap of making kitsch and just being broadly popular, sentimental, ultimately hollow experiences. I think we can use the vibes of cozy games to still explore deep human experiences. But again, if you take that approach, give your audience a heads up from the outset that that flavor of content is heading their way. Last but not least, we have speech barriers. So, speech barriers typically come up in multiplayer or co-op games where there is a pressure to communicate in a timely or precise manner. Any single-player game that doesn't require your voice input is accessible by design. However, if you're playing a multiplayer game such as Apex, something like its very robust ping system is an interesting design for people who can't or don't want to communicate verbally. This then ended up benefiting all players. Good job, Apex. So, a little recap. We have our 3 tomes of accessibility knowledge, our 8 categories where barriers can exist, and our big key point, hopefully giving you a new tool to help to create the next amazing accessible game. Thanks to everyone on the PlayAbility consultancy team for being cool with me picking their brains for this talk, as well as Ian Hamilton and Carey Waterton for their superb feedback. Thanks for having me, GAConf. If you're interested in getting a quarterly little games accessibility treat, you can head over to play-ability.net and sign up for our newsletter. Now, I'm going to go have some Battenberg as a snack.